I am absolutely 100% amazed that Dr. John Mearsheimer did not have a full-blown meltdown trying to explain to this guy exactly where he was going, especially after he explained this to him at least 3 or 4 times. But we got to talk about Piers Morgan, so let's go ahead and get into it.
Do you think there's any likelihood of Russia deploying any of its nuclear armament? For example, if Ukraine, emboldened now by new weaponry, thanks to Congress finally passing this big bill for money for them, if that was to start pushing the Russians back, could you see a situation where Vladimir Putin might use one of his tactical nuclear weapons?
My view has long been, Piers, that if Ukraine were to start winning on the battlefield and the Russians were losing, that the end result would be that the Russians would use nuclear weapons to rescue the situation. I think the Russians view what's happening with regard to the Ukrainian war as an existential threat. And given that the Russians think it's an existential threat, if they were in deep trouble, they were losing the war in Ukraine, I think they'd turn to nuclear.
It's an extra video that I made on Tuesday afternoon. I just figured I'd go ahead and kind of try to get it out there to start off Wednesday. So let's go ahead and watch this and kind of, let me just kind of show you guys why it is that people like Piers just advocate for the U.S. to just give all their money to their nations. But let's go ahead and get into it. In a lot of ways, Piers Morgan exposes, let's just say he exposes the feeling that comes from Europe anytime the United States is saber rattling, or really, in a lot of ways, anytime that the United States has decided to not do anything at all, physically. And what I mean by physically is actually putting boots on the ground. So I came across this interview a couple of days ago, and I looked at it, and of course, I'll be linking the full interview in the description box, about 36 minutes if you guys are interested. And of course, the interview is with Dr. John Mearsheimer. Now, John Mearsheimer has done a lot of lectures over the years at colleges, institutions, Hoover Institution, all those places there, anywhere where any form of strategy is discussed. He's pretty smart. He's actually very intelligent. I don't agree with everything the guy has to say, but when it comes to the situation of Ukraine and what's going on overseas with that little debacle, Russia and Ukraine, I got to admit that this guy has been pretty daggone spot on. Now, I understand that so far this right here is not as dynamic as my normal videos are, but the thing is this right here. Piers Morgan, and of course this where also includes Europe, and I'm not saying that every single European is like this, but the general consensus that a lot of Americans get when it comes to the topic of Europe is that they're kind of a bunch of freeloaders when you think about it. And I don't say that to actually insult Europe or insult the Brits or France or anybody who lives in those nations. I'm talking about the leaders, those who actually lead said nation. However, I do understand the fears of what could happen if Russia obviously chooses to invade Europe. Obviously, I understand that. However, at the same time, though, I am also of the opinion that maybe what should really and truly happen in this case is that maybe Europe should kick up a lot more money. Maybe what Europe should do is do a lot more to defend their own home. And of course, they have to rely on the United States so much. That right there is one of the biggest reasons why I was so much in favor of the whole pay your fair share argument when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. That right there being primarily if you are in NATO, you need to pay your fair share. You need to kick up a little bit more money to defend yourself and stop relying on the United States to do everything for you. This interview right here is about the topic of the Russia-Ukraine war, and of course, obviously, the fear that Russia at some point in time may choose to use a nuclear missile or a nuclear weapon on the country of Ukraine, seeing how it is that Ukraine and Russia have been at one another for about the past, let's see, that war started back in 2022. There was saber rattling going all the way back to when Obama was in office, but I really and truly am not interested in hearing Vladimir Putin give us like an hour and a half, 2 hour long lecture on Russian history, especially given the fact that a lot of that Russian history that he talks about was not proven. But you guys already know my stance when it comes to this particular conflict. I'm getting sick and tired of the United States putting money into this conflict, especially given the fact that Ukraine is not really and truly an actual ally. However, before we get to this interview, before we actually react to this and discuss why it is that Piers Morgan is just, what I said at the very beginning of the video, I want to go ahead and say this really quick. I'm also going to be explaining why it is that we're not exactly doing actual physical boots on the ground when it comes to Ukraine, and why it is that while we're not doing physical boots on the ground for Israel either, why it is definitely a little bit more important to protect Israel versus actual Ukraine itself. And also something else too at the very end of the video, another question pops up that I would just go ahead and say, Piers, let's just say that a lot of people oftentimes love to misjudge situations when the U.S. does actually get involved in actual conflicts and why they actually do so. But let's go ahead and roll this.
Just argue, though, which is that if you have a nuclear power like Russia and you have nuclear powers like America, and they've been helping Ukraine with their weaponry and so on, you have UK nuclear power, French nuclear power, why would they do that? If, as you say, if the ownership of nuclear weapons is the ultimate deterrent, why would Russia decide to risk a nuclear war with NATO, for example, if they did this? Because NATO would surely feel an absolute moral compulsion to respond in that eventuality.
No, I think what you're missing here is that Ukraine has no nuclear weapons of its own.
No, I know.
So if
I know,
the Russians
I think
use...
but that's not my argument. I know that. And in fact, you could argue that your original argument about Iran applying to Ukraine, would Russia have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons and had its own deterrent? I think that would back your argument. But here, I would argue that your argument slightly falls apart, because surely Russia would not want to do that, risking retaliation from America, UK and other countries, or a full-fledged NATO response, because NATO couldn't let a European sovereign democratic country come under nuclear attack and not respond, surely.
Okay, really quick, let me go ahead and say this. All right, the United States at this moment in time has chosen to freeze the funds that were set to go to Israel. They've done this kind of in a move that signals that the Biden administration is going to pander to his voters in the identity politics crowd, which of course is those voters that have a little bit more connection to the Middle East, that right there being the Palestinians, and of course it makes him look like he's pro-Hamas. However, at the exact same time, while doing that, it also remains to be seen, because the Biden administration is not exactly what we call a trustworthy administration when it comes to information. You try to walk both sides of the aisle. You try to walk this fine line. You try not to appease, let's just say that you try to piss off one side, but you end up pissing off both. This type of thing obviously is going to occur if you're very, very weak, which, by the way, is exactly what Vladimir Putin sees over in Russia. He sees an extremely weak leader in Joe Biden. Now, I want to go ahead and say this right now before we go any further, before I let Dr. Mearsheimer respond to what Piers was saying. Vladimir Putin is a guy that if you show some form of strength, he will be more inclined to actually work with you in the future, because you've kind of laid it down. You've kind of put your foot down. When Trump was in office, there was this article that came out where Donald Trump claimed that he threatened to nuke all of Moscow. And that right there's the biggest reason why it was that he got along with Trump. Of course, the mainstream media accused Trump of being a Russian agent, a Russian bot, all that type of stuff, because, quite frankly, this is kind of what they do, which is also kind of funny, too, given the Democratic Party's history on the country of Russia. It's not a very good history. If anything, the Democratic Party has always been the weakest party when it comes to Russia. I'll give you guys a few examples before this video ends. But the thing is this right here that you got to understand. Russia is also a country that has an economy about the size of the state of New York. Russia has a lot of natural oil reserves and, of course, a lot of natural gas reserves. I said natural oil reserves. What I meant to say was just oil reserves. Natural gas, and, of course, they have a lot of minerals. However, Russia also has a contested border with China. Now, a lot of people look at the situation between Russia and China, and they think to themselves, well, Russia and China are obviously getting along. Yeah, it's how do I say this? It's an alliance of convenience, meaning that it probably won't last very long. If you had a strong U.S. there on the other end of the earth, Russia might be a little bit, let's just say, deterred in entering into a full-blown partnership with China. And if they were to enter any form of partnership with China, let's just say that the rivalry between those two nations is actually very, very deep. We don't really oftentimes hear much about it because it's gone back so far. But obviously the two nations are, in fact, working together at this moment in time. But the thing about this particular video is to talk about overall nuclear deterrence and why it is that if Russia was to use nuclear missiles, why it is that the United States more than likely would not respond with nuclear missiles, especially if Russia uses them on Ukraine. Let me break it down for you. Nobody wants to use nukes. Not only does nobody want to use nukes, nobody wants to get hit with a nuke. That's why nukes exist. It's mutually assured destruction. And of course, I did do a video recently on why Tucker Carlson was wrong about Japan and overall nuclear missiles. It's a necessary evil that we quite frankly have to deal with. I know a lot of people quite frankly are going to be upset about this, but here's the problem though. If we disarm ourselves, if we pull our nukes, next thing you know, somebody's going to want to nuke us, especially given the fact that we're the only nation that's actually launched a nuclear missile onto anybody. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just simply saying. Also, something else too, our nuclear missiles are much, much more effective. And even though we may not have as many of those on the books, we do still have enough nuclear missiles in our arsenal to destroy the world 10 times over. Russia also has the exact same type of arsenal as well, but their arsenal is also a little bit different, which I'll explain on the other end of this piece right here. But getting back to what Mearsheimer and Piers Morgan are discussing, it's the possibility that Russia, if they're losing the war, they may choose to use nuclear missiles against Ukraine. And seeing as that Ukraine does not have nukes there anymore, obviously they are a target for Russia to do so. Let's get back to it.
Yes, it could. Because if we responded with nuclear weapons against Russia, Russia would then respond with nuclear weapons against the United States of America. And no American president, in my opinion, is willing to sacrifice New York or Chicago or Los Angeles for Ukraine.
So the idea that sorry, but Professor, you cannot honestly think that Vladimir Putin could drop a nuclear weapon on the people of Ukraine and there would be no response from America or the West.
I said there wouldn't be a nuclear response. Well, there may be a response, but there won't be a nuclear response, because you want to remember that if we hit Russia with American nuclear weapons or Western nuclear weapons, the end result is the Russians will retaliate against us. And we do not want to be hit with nuclear weapons. This is why we don't want Ukraine to have nuclear weapons. It's why we didn't want West Germany or South Korea or Japan to have nuclear weapons during the Cold War.
East Germany, you mean, do you?
No, West Germany. We didn't want West Germany to have nuclear weapons because our great fear was that if the Soviets overran West Germany, the West Germans would use nuclear weapons, they would hit the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would retaliate against the United States. We don't want to be...
The part about West Germany at the very, very end is actually true. You see, back in the days of the Iron Curtain, Germany, of course, was split into East Germany and West Germany, of course, was allied to us. By the way, this right here gives me a good opportunity to explain to you guys why the Democratic Party has always been terrible on the topic of Russia, which I'll explain here in a second after I explain this part right here to you guys. So basically, the thinking is that if Russia begins to lose the war in Ukraine, that they'll use tactical nuclear missiles. Now, tactical nuclear missiles versus straight-up nuclear missiles is this right here. Tactical nuclear missiles are typically nuclear missiles that are used on the battlefield of war itself. They're typically designed to go after troops and, tanks and, of course, artillery. They obviously cause fallout, all that type of stuff there. And, of course, they're much, much smaller in nature, but they're obviously very, very dangerous. And, of course, if you add up all the nuclear missiles, it's probably more like 100 to 200 times over, but that right there is not the point of this video. The point is, would the United States respond? Dr. Mearsheimer never said the United States would respond with nuclear missiles. And at this moment in time, you've got a president that's very, very, very weak. If Vladimir Putin sees that Joe Biden is pulling funds from Israel, an actual ally, a country that we've always been allied with in the Middle East, if he sees him pulling those funds to get some brand new voters or to keep a certain voter base in his pocket, even though they probably still won't vote for him given his late response to everything, then obviously weakness exists. So Putin's going to do what? He's obviously going to intensify the attack on the nation of Ukraine. I promise I'll be very, very brief with this, but at the end of World War II, Stalin was coming in harder into Eastern Europe. The president at the time was FDR, and then eventually Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He eventually passed away. I'm going to link this video right here in the description box called Silence Patton. This right here is a video that, quite frankly, I was going to be using some of it for the source material of a video I've got coming out in the future called Why Patton Was Right. And, of course, talking about why it was that Russia really and truly did not win World War II. In a lot of ways, what happened was the United States won the overall ground conflict, conquered everything, and then we just gave it to Russia in the end of the war. Harry Truman had an opportunity to put a stop to this, but obviously he chose to be weak, and eventually Stalin got pretty much half of Europe. Half of Europe, by the way, still was forced to live under some form of totalitarianism because of the Democratic Party. I still believe that what we should have done, because we were in overall better standing at the end of World War II, was kick their butts back into Russia where they belong. Don't worry, that video right there will be coming out in the near future. There have been several times the Democratic Party loves to talk about Russia, but then they turn right back around and they're completely weak when it comes to the topic of Russia. LBJ was weak on it. Clinton was weak on it. I mean, Jimmy Carter was horrible on the topic of Russia. And, of course, Barack Hussein Obama, when he was president, he didn't really do anything when Vladimir Putin chose to basically go over our heads and bomb everybody in Syria. And also at the exact same time, he also targeted U.S. personnel. By the way, the Russian bounty scandal that they tried to pin on Trump back in 2020, that actually was a retread of an article from 2013 when the Russians put bounties on our troops' heads in Afghanistan when Obama was in office. Obama didn't do anything about that, and of course we all know about Crimea.
In a nuclear war.
But then it seems if
So we're not going to fight.
Right, I understand that. But if a nuclear power like Russia can simply use its nuclear weapons with impunity and other nuclear powers do not respond, then the nuclear deterrent collapses, doesn't it? Because they've just ignored it.
No, it doesn't. It has no effect on our nuclear deterrent. Our nuclear deterrent remains intact. And the fact is the Soviet Union during the Cold War and Russia today will not attack the United States for fear that we would use our nuclear deterrent against the Soviet Union in the Cold War and Russia today. But the point is that if the Russians were to use nuclear weapons inside of Ukraine today, we would not respond with a nuclear attack on Russia because that would precipitate a general thermonuclear war. And the last thing we want is a general thermonuclear war. This is not to say we would be happy about the fact that Ukraine was hit with nuclear weapons, because we certainly would not be, and we certainly would respond in some way. But we would not respond with a nuclear strike on Russia.
How would we respond that would have any effect?
It would be something like sanctions, if anything else. I mean, Biden is the only president I could think of that would actually allow U.S. personnel to get hurt or killed and not even respond on their behalf. So he just put sanctions on is what he would do. I don't know if you guys noticed or not, but Russia's GDP has actually gone through the roof. And I'm not advocating for a war with Russia or anything like that. God knows it's the last thing we need to do. But I think that this situation in Ukraine, if we just let it play out the way it is, then quite frankly, Russia would not be in a strong position that they are now. You see, the sanctions that we've been levying on them have been forcing them to go into something that they quite frankly have the capability to do, which is their own oil, their own natural gas, and their own mineral supply. It's something that quite frankly our own GOP and Democratic Party establishment, for whatever reason, did not want Donald Trump to do when he was president, which is to use America's actual resources. If America was to fully go into their resources, use their oil, do all their everything they need to do on their own without outside influence, America could be a greater superpower than what it already is. It's part of the reason why, as a lot of people want us to just go ahead and diversify our economy. But let's get back to the point at hand. The fact of the matter is that Biden's sanctions that he has put on Russia, the only thing it's done is force Russia to go in the opposite direction that they would normally go, and it's actually worked out kind of nice for them. Sanctions is about all the hell you're going to get out of Joe Biden. Just saying. Let's get back to the topic.
And Russia today. But the point is that if the Russians were to use nuclear weapons inside of Ukraine today, we would not respond with a nuclear attack on Russia because that would precipitate a general thermonuclear war. And the last thing we want is a general thermonuclear war. This is not to say we would be happy about the fact that Ukraine was hit with nuclear weapons, because we certainly would not be, and we certainly would respond in some way. But we would not respond with a nuclear strike on Russia.
How would we respond that would have any effect?
I'm not sure. It's very hard to say. I mean, even if we used simply conventional weapons, we got involved in the war with Russia, we would then have a great power war between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, which included the United States. And once you have a great power war involving Russia versus the United States, the danger of nuclear escalation presents itself. And this, of course, is why President Biden has...
To go on top of this, nobody wants to join our woke social justice warrior military, even though the military itself, I've talked to a lot of guys who are still serving, they haven't gotten a hold of a lot of the crap that we've been seeing out there. Obviously, it's being done to repel people from actually enlisting. Of course, people have gotten kind of a bad, which, by the way, we'll talk more about that there in a video that I've got planned this week on why it isn't nobody wants to join, because I wanted to do a Claymore version instead of the normal Gear Issue 33 stuff. But the point is this right here. Putting troops on the ground at this moment in time, especially in Ukraine, would be completely and totally suicidal for this administration. Many people believe that Biden wants to start a war so that way it would ensure his reelection. The problem is that little fallacy that you start a war to get reelected is not exactly as accurate as people think that it is. That argument about starting a war to get reelected is kind of a fallacy. Just figure I'd toss that out there before we get to this last part, and this next part.
Has wisely said that under no circumstances will American military forces be introduced into the Ukraine war, because he understands that once you do that, you're out on the slippery slope. You're out on the slippery slope to nuclear escalation. And the last thing we want, as I've emphasized to you, is a nuclear war between Russia and the United States.
No, I get that. But if Russia was to use one, that is right there, the nuclear escalation that you are so keen for everyone to avoid. It's a deliberate act of nuclear provocation. And I just cannot imagine that in that eventuality, with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians being slaughtered with a nuclear weapon by Russia, I just cannot imagine that there would be no similar response from the West. They would have to.
I don't believe that. I don't believe that for 1 second.
Well, then what you're really doing, I don't want to put words in your mouth,
war.
but aren't you painting a picture then of Russia being effectively infallible here? They can do what the hell they like.
Now, here's where I will disagree with Dr. Mearsheimer at. It's the first thing where he said where Biden wisely has not put troops on the ground or anything like that there. It's not that Biden has wisely not done it. It's the fact that the powers that be don't trust Biden with troops on the ground. But when he says, I just don't believe that, given his track record, especially at a lot of these lectures. Like I said, I'll try to link a couple in the description box for you guys if you're interested in listening to his lectures on Ukraine. The guy is pretty daggone smart, and I think he's been very, very good when it comes to this particular topic, which is U.S.-Ukraine. There's a lot of other takes that he has that, quite frankly, I don't fully agree with, but at least on the topic of U.S., Ukraine, Russia, I think he's been very good on that one. But there is also this other thing that, quite frankly, needs to be discussed, and, of course, I'm going to let this last part, which is about 2 minutes long, run, and then I'm going to come back on the other end and explain to you guys why it is that Piers Morgan makes his side of the aisle look like nothing more than just good old-fashioned freeloaders, and also to go on top of this, the things that these people obviously don't understand when it comes to actual foreign policy. Let's go ahead and roll this. Okay. Now, before I respond to all that, and of course, this is the last part of the video, there is one more video that I'm going to be linking either A, in the comment section or the description box. And it's going to be this video right here from Caspian Report, where he actually details everything going on in the Middle East. And of course, he basically concurs with the whole argument about a lot of these nations being freeloaders. By the way, I'm not talking about the people who live in those nations. I'm talking about the leadership of those nations, especially NATO. Here's the thing that you got to understand. These people tend to think that the United States needs to just get involved in every conflict, okay? They just need to get involved in every conflict. Now, England, the nation itself, is a pretty daggone long way away from Ukraine. Germany is not that far away from Ukraine, and neither is Poland. Now, Poland has taken a lot of the weapons that we've given them, and they've turned their nation into a pretty daggone powerful nation militarily. Germany has the capability of being a top 3 nation military power-wise. They have the capability of it. The problem is they rely on the United States too much. France has got the capability of being top 5. They rely on the United States too daggone much. In some cases, they may already be that, but still at the same time, though, you can imagine exactly how powerful that nation would be if it didn't rely on the United States, if they actually used its own resources, which is exactly what the Trump administration was upset about. They didn't like the fact that the United States was covering everything, that we were paying way too much when it came to overall national security. And of course, we didn't get much relief on that. But of course, Europe was kicking in money. One nation that I used to give a lot of grief to was the nation of Spain. I used to say that Spain was not paying its fair share and that Spain was probably the biggest freeloader. But obviously, I go into the numbers and I find out that during the Trump years, that Spain was actually paying its fair share. They were actually kicking up a lot of money. Now, granted, we could all argue that the money should be more, and I agree with that. I also think our overall spending, when you actually cut out the crap, you'll be amazed exactly what we save when it comes to U.S. military spending. And the last point that I want to make is this right here. Earlier in the video, or actually it wasn't this video here, it was the video that I released at 6 o'clock on Tuesday night. I talked about why it was that you do defend Israel. Israel has nuclear missiles. Okay. Now, Russia's got a lot of nuclear missiles too, but what I didn't tell you is that most of their nuclear missiles are tactical and defensive in nature, designed to shoot down other missiles. There's not that many missiles that Russia has that they can actually throw at the United States with the actual true capability. I mean, a lot of them would probably be inaccurate. Of course, some can. And, the United States has also got a massively large defense network system. I'll try to link this video right here in the description box as well so that way you guys can see it. Other thing that you got to consider when it comes to this actual topic is this here. Israel being a nuclear power, Ukraine is not. Ukraine is not a NATO ally, but yet Israel is in the Middle East. When he talked about Saddam Hussein and Kuwait, people forget that Kuwait controlled a good portion of the world's energy supply, oil. That right there is the real reason why it was that we went in there. We didn't want Saddam Hussein controlling a quarter of the world's energy supply. That right there is the real reason why it was that we chose to go into that nation. It makes it almost look like the European press and European personalities just want the United States to get into another conflict, into another war, and take care of what could eventually be a European problem. I would argue that Europe at this moment in time needs to kick up their fair share for other reasons, and one of those other reasons is that the current administration, which I've alluded to already in this video, is pretty daggone weak. It's not going to come to your rescue either. So you might want to go ahead and learn to fend for yourself. Ukraine was actually doing that. They didn't want us to get involved, and all of a sudden we chose to get involved, which obviously, quite frankly, we should not have gotten involved. Just saying, if you're in Europe, you may want to tell your leaders to invest more money into their own militaries rather than waiting on the U.S. handout to come in to save you. But what do I know? I'm just some guy on the internet who runs his mouth and is obviously losing his hair and is obviously getting older. Tell me what you guys think in the comment section. I would love to hear what you guys have got to say. Please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Please share the video. Please sign up in the comment section. And I'll see you guys later.